Well, hey there, Aletheia Church. Hope that you are doing well. Just want to recap our video from this past Sunday, where I preached on Acts chapter 14, verses 1 through 18, entitled Keeping the Focus on the Faithfulness of Jesus. And I started out my sermon just by recapping what we had seen throughout the book of Acts in Luke's account of the start of the early church. And what I had said was that the book of Acts is the story of Jesus' faithfulness to his church, how he both promised to send the Holy Spirit and sent the Holy Spirit, and in sending the Holy Spirit, empowered normal, everyday men and women to spread the gospel, how he empowered them to preach, how he empowered them to suffer, how he empowered them to plant churches in new places, and empowered us to love others well, and empowered us to be persecuted. And so I talked about how in the midst of being empowered to do ministry, one of the kind of weird things we can see crop up in ministry as we are living out this call to be his witnesses is that we can start struggling to find the difference between what we gain from ministry and the ways in which we are served by ministry and the ways that we seek affirmation and approval from others inside of ministry context, that we can struggle to find and differentiate between what is healthy in that and when that becomes focused solely on us and loses its initial purpose and intention of making much of Jesus. And so one of the first things we see in those first 7 verses in Acts chapter 14 is that if we lose that focus on making things about Jesus and focus in on people, that people are going to disappoint us. And really, those first 7 verses can really confront a lot of things in our own hearts because we long for human acceptance, and that's a good thing to long for that acceptance and approval, that God even placed that in our hearts. But if we spend our time focusing on what others might think of us or how we might say the perfect thing at the right time for people, what will often happen is we become paralyzed and we lose our ability to rightfully share and witness to others, and we start caring more about what they think instead of what others will think about us. And so we even saw there in those first 7 verses that as Luke puffs up Paul and Barnabas, he shares that they do a great job and that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believe. But then there's also another sect of people that are not believers, and they hate them so much that they drive them out and they try to stone them. And so we're encouraged here in these first 7 verses to choose Jesus over people, that we have to do the hard work of analyzing ourselves and asking the question, who do I fear more, God or man? Because the key to loving well is knowing that people will fail us and we need to choose God over people. The second thing we see in that crazy story in verses 8 through 18 is what can happen if there is a failure to keep the focus on Jesus and how dangerous it can become. We see that the crowds there at Lystra begin to worship Paul and Barnabas as if they are gods. If we fail to keep the focus on Jesus, we risk people worshiping us and worshiping leaders within the church rather than God. And there's a real danger to this because we will be tempted to seek the praise of man and have people become dependent upon us instead of dependent upon God. And without accountability, we're going to fail in these areas. And so I encourage us at the end of the sermon to do a couple of things so that we can be checking ourselves and checking others on whether our ministry is man-centered or whether our ministry is Jesus-centered. The first one, right, was that reminder to keep people as the forefront of who we're trying to serve, but remember that people will fail us, but God does not. And that we can help ourselves have a proper understanding and approach to that as long as we are renewing our minds consistently in the promises of who God is and what he has done for us. The second thing I encouraged us to do was to not buy into our own hype, that it would have been easy for Paul and Barnabas to buy into their ministry success. But we are encouraged not to buy into our own hype, but see ministry success as God's faithfulness to us, just like he had done throughout the book of Acts. The last thing we are encouraged to do is to focus our attention to God's faithfulness, not our own work. And Paul does a really good job of this in Lystra when he is asking the men and women there not to sacrifice to him and Barnabas, but he says, look, we're men just like you. Instead, look at how God has been faithful to you for thousands of years before we ever even showed up here to preach the gospel. And so, church, I hope tonight that you'll talk through the reality of these things. Some of you guys may not struggle with this very much. Some of you guys may struggle with this quite a bit, but you can encourage and engage one another at a heart level on making sure we're keeping the focus of our church, our ministry, our time, and our lives on Jesus and not the approval and validation of others. Reminding ourselves that we exist as a church for God's glory. So let's trust Jesus. Let's worship Jesus. Let's tell others about Jesus. And let's serve our city and others for the glory of Jesus. Church, I love you guys. I miss you. I'm excited about being able to hopefully gather together again in a few weeks. But as we continue to do ministry from home, let's be the church.